It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Hand over your keys, Thomas Miller snapped, his hand outstretched over the white linen tablecloth of the estate's conservatory. You don't look like you belong in a car that costs more than your annual salary anyway, and Jessica needs a reliable way to get to the gallery opening tonight. Grace Miller didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her fingers curled around a glass of ice water. The condensation was biting and cold, a sharp contrast to the humid, floral-scented air of the room. Around the table, the elite of the county, including 3 members of the local historical board, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were witnesses, though they tried to look like they were fascinated by their salads. "It's my car, Dad," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "I bought it with my own bonuses, from my actual job." Thomas laughed, a sharp barking sound that smelled of expensive bourbon and arrogance. He adjusted his silk tie, the gold of his watch catching the light from the crystal chandelier. "Your job is playing with spreadsheets in a cubicle, Grace. I'm the one who maintains the Miller name. I'm the one who keeps this roof over your head. If I say your sister needs the car, she takes the car." Across the table, Jessica Miller smirked, swirling a glass of vintage Chardonnay. She was draped in cashmere, her eyes gleaming with the casual cruelty of a favored child. "Don't be difficult, Grace. It's just for the night. Besides, you're an auditor. You're supposed to be good at managing limited resources, aren't you?" The laughter that followed was small, polite, and devastating. It was the sound of a family that had spent years treating Grace like a guest in her own life. Thomas gestured impatiently, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a nuisance that was cluttering up his vision of a perfect, wealthy dynasty. The tension in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Grace felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the rage that she had learned to sharpen into a blade rather than a scream. She looked at her father, seeing the lines of entitlement etched into his face. He felt untouchable. He felt like the king of a mountain he hadn't actually climbed. The side door creaked open and Zoe Miller stepped in. The 9-year-old was clutching a small violin case, her eyes wide as she took in the heavy silence of the room. She looked small and fragile in her Sunday dress, a stark contrast to the predatory atmosphere of the dinner. "Grandpa," Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. "I finished my practice. Can I show you the new piece?" Thomas didn't even turn his head. "Not now, Zoe. We're discussing adult matters." "But you promised," the girl insisted, moving closer. She pulled the instrument from its case, a modest, well-loved violin that Grace had bought for her. "It's the one for the recital." Thomas's patience snapped like a dry twig. He stood up, his chair screeching against the marble floor. The sound was like a physical blow. He reached out and snatched the violin from Zoe's small hands. "I said not now," he roared. With a sickening crack, he slammed the instrument down against the edge of the heavy mahogany sideboard. The wood splintered, the strings snapping with a high-pitched, mournful wail that echoed through the conservatory. Zoe let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. "There," Thomas panted, his face flushed a deep, angry purple. "Now you don't have to practice. Go to your room. This house is for winners, not for people who make noise and demand attention." Jessica didn't even flinch. She just took another sip of her wine, her expression bored. But Grace felt something shift deep inside her. The sleeping lion wasn't just awake, it was hungry. She watched her niece flee the room in tears, the sound of the girls sobbing fading into the distance. Grace stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out her car keys, sliding them across the table toward her father. "Take them," Grace said. Her voice was so calm it was terrifying. Thomas smirked, snatching the keys up. "Finally, some common sense. I knew you'd see reason." "Oh, I see everything very clearly now," she replied. She reached into her bag again, her fingers brushing against a cold, metal flash drive. It was a small thing, no bigger than a thumb, but it contained the results of the secret forensic audit she'd been conducting on the Miller estate for the last 6 months. She knew about the restructuring. She knew about the diverted funds, the unpaid property taxes, and the way Thomas had been bleeding the family trust dry to pay for Jessica's gallery and his own vanity. Thomas thought he was the master of this house. He didn't realize that Grace was the one who knew exactly where the foundation was rotting. "I'm going to go pack a bag for Zoe," Grace said, her eyes locked on her father's. "We'll be staying at a hotel tonight." "Fine," Thomas dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Go, it'll be quieter without the both of you." Grace walked out of the conservatory, the sound of her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble, a steady, predatory beat. She didn't look back at the broken violin or the smug sister or the arrogant father. She had spent years auditing risks for multi-million-dollar firms. She knew exactly how to identify a liability. As she reached the foyer, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had saved under a single initial. "It's Grace," she said when the call connected. "The audit is complete. I have the signatures, the diverted account numbers, and the proof of the deed transfer. Start the proceedings. I want the process server at the estate by Monday morning." She paused, looking up at the grand portrait of Thomas that hung in the hallway. "And call Sheriff Miller," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure ice. "Tell him we're going to need an eviction notice. I'm taking back my house." The next morning, the breakfast room felt like a tomb despite the bright Virginia sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The scent of bitter, over-extracted espresso hung heavy in the air, clashing with the delicate floral notes of the lilies on the sideboard. Grace Miller sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her movements precise as she stirred a single drop of cream into her tea. The silver spoon made a sharp, rhythmic clicking against the bone china, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Thomas Miller entered 5 minutes later, the heavy oak doors swinging shut with a thud that echoed through the foyer. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he snapped his fingers at the sideboard, waiting for the house staff to pour his coffee. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of boredom and irritation, as if she were a piece of furniture he had forgotten to sell. "I've had the contractors look at the West Wing," he said, his voice raspy and thick with unearned authority. He didn't look up from the morning paper. "Jessica needs a proper suite for the gala preparations. Your current room has the best light for her makeup artists. You'll move your things to the attic storage by tomorrow evening." Grace didn't flinch. She felt the cold weight of her phone in her pocket, a digital tether to the evidence she had spent all night organizing. "The attic is damp, Father. My mother's journals are stored there." He finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Then throw them out. They're as useless as that career of yours. You're a guest in this house, Grace. It's time you started acting like one instead of a squatter." The insult hung in the air, sharp and jagged. It was the second time in 12 hours he had reminded her of her supposed status. But this time, the rage didn't burn. It simmered, a steady, cooling blue flame. Jessica Miller drifted into the room moments later, her silk robe trailing behind her like a shroud. She looked refreshed, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had slept soundly after destroying a child's heart. She sat next to her father, reaching over to pat his hand. "Did you tell her about Zoe?" Jessica asked, her voice dripping with a performative concern that made Grace's skin crawl. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned to Grace, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "We've decided Zoe needs a more disciplined environment. All that crying over a piece of wood and string. It's dramatic, Grace. It's attention-seeking. We're looking into boarding schools in the morning." "She's 9 years old," Grace said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "She lost her mother's violin. She isn't seeking attention, she's grieving." "She's a liability to the family image," Thomas snapped, slamming his hand onto the table. The silver rattled. "I won't have a hysterical child ruining the atmosphere of this estate. My decision is final. And don't look at me with that judgment. I provided for you and I provide for her. That gives me the right to decide what happens under this roof." Grace took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. The liquid was lukewarm, but she didn't mind. Under the table, her thumb brushed the screen of her phone. A notification had just cleared. Audit complete. Discrepancies confirmed. She thought about the deed she had found in the safe deposit box, the one her mother had signed over to her years ago, hidden from the man who had spent his life bleeding the estate dry. She thought about the diverted funds Thomas had been using to pay for Jessica's lavish lifestyle, money that legally belonged to Zoe's trust. "You're right, Father," Grace said, her voice eerily calm. "Ownership does grant a certain level of executive power." Thomas let out a short, mocking laugh. "I'm glad you finally understand. Now make sure you're out of that room by tomorrow. I don't want to hear another word about it." Grace stood up, the legs of her chair scraping softly against the marble floor. She looked at her sister, then at the man who had stolen her peace for a decade. She felt a surge of secret power, a quiet thrill that hummed in her veins like a live wire. They were so certain of their victory. They were so convinced that she was the same broken girl who had left for the city 5 years ago. "I'll be out of the room," she promised, her eyes locking onto her father's. "But I think you'll find that Monday morning is going to be much more transformative than a simple room change." "What is that supposed to mean?" Jessica asked, her brow furrowing as she sensed the shift in the air. Grace didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, predatory beat against the stone. She had 48 hours. She had the signatures. She had Sheriff Miller on standby. And most importantly, she had the truth. As she reached the hallway, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to the process server. "Monday, 9:00 a.m., front gates. Don't be late." Behind her, she heard Thomas complaining about the quality of the bacon, his voice loud and arrogant, completely unaware that the walls of his kingdom were already beginning to crumble. The countdown had begun, and Grace Miller wasn't just auditing the books anymore. She was auditing his life. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy, leaden sky that seemed to press down on the sprawling Miller estate. Grace Miller sat in the back corner of a dim, local diner 3 miles from the house, the scent of stale grease and burnt coffee thick in the air. She checked her watch, a simple, stainless steel piece that kept far better time than the gold-plated monstrosities her father favored. The bell above the door jingled, and Sheriff Miller stepped inside. He didn't look like a man coming to a social breakfast. His uniform was pressed, his expression grim. He slid into the vinyl booth across from her, the plastic seat groaning under the weight of his duty belt. "You're sure about this, Grace?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the sizzle of the griddle. She didn't hesitate. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was the original deed to the estate, bearing her mother's maiden name and the ironclad transfer documents that Thomas had thought were buried in a defunct offshore holding company. She had spent 6 months untangling the web, and now the gold-embossed seal of the state sat atop the pile like a judge's gavel. "The forensic audit is complete, Ryan," she said, using the sheriff's first name to bridge the professional gap. "He didn't just mismanage the funds. He systematically drained the trust my mother set up for the property taxes. He's been living in a house that, legally, he hasn't owned in over 2 years. I've been the one paying the insurance, the taxes, and the maintenance through the secondary trust he couldn't touch." Sheriff Miller flipped through the pages, his eyes hardening as he saw the signatures. "He's going to fight this. You know how he gets when he's cornered." "Let him," she replied, her voice as cold as the morning air. "The eviction notice is signed. The process server is briefed. I just need you there to ensure he doesn't decide that the law doesn't apply to him." He nodded slowly, closing the folder. "Monday morning, 9 sharp. I'll be at the gates." Grace felt the cold weight of the evidence settle into a satisfying hum of anticipation. She left the diner and drove back to the estate, her mind already moving to the next phase. When she entered the foyer, the sound of laughter echoed from the dining hall. She found Thomas Miller standing near the fireplace, holding a crystal glass of scotch despite the early hour. Beside him, Jessica Miller was admiring a velvet-lined box on the table. "Ah, the auditor returns," Thomas said, his voice dripping with a casual, practiced cruelty. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on the shimmering watch inside the box. "Come see what real success looks like, Grace." "I picked this up this morning. Patek Philippe. It cost more than your annual salary at that drab little firm of yours." Grace walked over, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat on the marble. She looked at the watch, then at her father's flushed, arrogant face. The smell of expensive tobacco and peat surrounded him, the scent of a man who believed he was untouchable. "It's a beautiful piece, Thomas," she said quietly, "though I wonder if the timing is quite right." Jessica let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, don't mind her, Dad. She's just bitter because her idea of a big purchase is a new calculator. Honestly, Grace, those shoes you're wearing, they're practically scuffed. Have you no pride?" "I have exactly as much pride as I can afford," Grace replied, her gaze shifting to her sister. "And I think you'll find that I've accounted for every penny." Thomas waved a dismissive hand, the ice clinking in his glass. "You've always been so literal. That's why you'll never lead, Grace. You're a bean counter. You spend your life looking at what other men have built and trying to find the cracks. But look around you." He gestured to the vaulted ceilings, the oil paintings, the sheer opulence of the room. "There are no cracks here. This is a fortress." "Even fortresses have foundations," Grace said. She reached out and touched the edge of the velvet box, her finger lingering on the soft fabric. "And foundations can be audited." "Enough of this nonsense," Thomas snapped, his mood shifting as it always did when he felt he wasn't being sufficiently admired. "I have a gala to prepare for on Tuesday. Jessica, make sure the caterers know the champagne must be vintage. None of that domestic swill." "Of course, Dad," Jessica said, casting a final, pitying look at Grace. "Some of us actually have a reputation to maintain." Grace watched them walk away, their voices fading as they headed toward the West Wing. She stood alone in the center of the hall, the silence of the house feeling heavy and expectant. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the brass key she had received from the locksmith an hour ago. It was the key to the main, gate's master override, a key Thomas didn't even know existed. She walked to the window and looked out at the long, winding driveway. In 48 hours, the arrogance in this house would turn to ash. She could almost see the sheriff's cruiser pulling up, almost hear the sound of the process server's voice as he handed over the papers that would strip Thomas of everything he used to bully the world. She wasn't just counting beans anymore. She was counting the seconds until his kingdom fell. And as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn, Grace Miller knew that Monday morning wouldn't just be an audit. It would be an execution. The Sunday sun rose with a deceptive warmth, casting long, golden fingers across the manicured terrace of the Miller estate. Grace Miller sat at the wrought-iron table, the silver spoon in her hand feeling unnaturally heavy as she stirred her tea. The scent of expensive, dark-roasted coffee drifted from the head of the table, where her father sat swiping through a tablet, his face illuminated by the glow of his own perceived success. Thomas Miller didn't look like a man on the brink of a collapse. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he believed was eternal. He took a slow sip of his espresso, the gold band of his watch catching the light, a watch Grace knew had been purchased with the dividends from her own stolen trust fund. "I've decided to move forward with the acquisition of the northern lot," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, oily confidence. He didn't look up at her. "It'll double the footprint of the estate. I'm calling it the Miller Legacy Wing." Grace felt a sharp tang of bitterness, stronger than the tea on her tongue. "A legacy wing," she repeated quietly. "Are you sure the foundation is solid enough for that, Thomas?" He finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing with the casual disdain he usually reserved for telemarketers. "The foundation is ironclad. I built this from nothing, Grace. I know every bolt and every beam." "Sometimes the beams look strong until you check the internal rot," she said, her voice steady. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, serrated edge of the master override key. The sensation was a grounding wire for her fury. "I was looking over the structural audits yesterday. There are discrepancies." Thomas let out a short, barking laugh that made Zoe Miller flinch at the far end of the table. The young girl sat without her violin, her small hands folded in her lap, looking like a ghost in her own home. Jessica Miller, seated next to her, reached out to adjust Zoe's collar, her eyes fixed on Thomas with a hungry, expectant sort of loyalty. "Discrepancies," Thomas mocked, setting his tablet down with a sharp asterisk clack against the glass. "You've spent too much time in dark offices, Grace. You see shadows where there's only light. You're a glorified bookkeeper. You deal in decimals, I deal in empires." "Even empires fall when the math doesn't add up," Grace replied. She looked directly at Jessica, who was busy spreading marmalade with the precision of a surgeon. "Don't you agree, Jessica?" "It would be a shame to lose everything because someone forgot to carry a 1. Jessica didn't look up. "Father knows what he's doing, Grace. You've always been so dramatic about the details. It's why you never fit in here." The arrogance in the air was almost thick enough to choke on, smelling of expensive cologne and misplaced security. It was the peak of their hubris, a towering monument to the belief that they were untouchable. "I suppose you're right," Grace said, standing up. The sound of her chair scraping against the stone terrace was like a starter pistol. "I'm just a bookkeeper. But tomorrow morning at 9, the audit is going to be very thorough. I'd suggest you make sure all your personal items are accounted for. Once the process starts, things tend to move very quickly." Thomas didn't even bother to respond. He was already back to his tablet, dismissively waving a hand as if shooing a fly. He didn't see the way Grace's eyes lingered on the heavy oak doors of the house, or the way she glanced at her watch. 22 hours. She walked away from the table, the rhythmic asterisk click-clack of her heels on the marble floor echoing through the foyer. She passed the empty space where Zoe's violin should have been, a silent scream of the injustice that had fueled this fire. The day dragged on with an agonizing slowness. Grace spent the afternoon in her room, the door locked, watching the shadows shift across the lawn. Below, she could hear the sounds of a house preparing for a victory it would never see. Thomas was on the phone, his booming voice echoing through the vents as he bragged to his associates about the big move, coming Monday. As the sun began to set, staining the sky a bruised purple, Grace saw a black sedan pull up to the edge of the property line. It didn't enter. It just sat there, its headlights dark, a silent sentinel waiting for the dawn. She picked up her phone and sent a single text to the number labeled Sheriff Miller *. "Everything is in place. 9 a.m. sharp." The reply came seconds later. "We'll be there." Grace stood by the window, the master override key clutched in her hand. Tomorrow, the locks would change. Tomorrow, the Miller legacy would be exposed for the hollow shell it was. She looked down at the terrace, where the remnants of brunch still sat, forgotten by the staff. The king was in his counting house, unaware that the walls were already turning to glass. She closed her eyes, listening to the silence of the house. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a fuse that had finally reached the powder. The morning of the Miller legacy brunch arrived with a deceptive, glittering frost that coated the estate in a layer of fragile silver. Inside the grand dining room, the air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive pine, and the heavy, floral notes of the lily-of-the-valley perfume Jessica Miller had sprayed liberally over the centerpieces. Thomas Miller stood at the head of the long mahogany table, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a gold-rimmed mirror. He looked every bit the patriarch of a dynasty, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. Grace Miller watched him from the doorway, her fingers grazing the cold, jagged teeth of the master override key hidden in her pocket. She felt a strange, detached calm. The house was full of the town's elite, the mayor, the local bank president, and several members of the historical society, all here to celebrate the generosity of the man who had built his throne on a foundation of stolen inheritance and broken promises. "Grace, for heaven's sake, move out of the way," Jessica snapped as she bustled past, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble floor. "The caterers need to get the champagne through, and you're standing there like a ghost at a feast. And where is Zoe? I told her to stay in the sunroom. She looks miserable, and it's ruining the aesthetic of the morning." "She's in the library," Grace said, her voice a steady, low anchor in the middle of her sister's frantic energy. "She's reading, since she doesn't have a violin to practice anymore." Jessica rolled her eyes, her jewelry rattling with the movement. Still on about that. It was a piece of wood, Grace. Father will buy her a new one once the next development deal clears. Now go find your seat at the far end of the table. I've put the mayor next to Father, so try not to bore anyone with talk of risk audits and spreadsheets. Grace didn't argue. She moved toward the library, finding Zoe Miller tucked into a window seat. The 9-year-old looked small against the backdrop of the towering, leather-bound books that Thomas had bought by the yard to fill space. Zoe didn't look up when Grace entered. Her eyes were fixed on the driveway outside. "They're coming soon, aren't they?" Zoe whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Grace sat beside her, the silk of her dress rustling. "Yes, just like I promised. Everything is going to change today, Zoe. No more hiding and no more being told you don't matter." She reached out and squeezed the girl's hand. Zoe's skin was cold, but she nodded, a spark of something, hope perhaps, or just the grim anticipation of a child who had seen too much, flickering in her dark eyes. By 10 o'clock, the brunch was in full swing. The sound of crystal clinking and the low hum of polite, wealthy conversation filled the room. Thomas was in his element, holding court at the head of the table. He leaned back, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand, his face flushed with the pride of a man who had successfully gaslit an entire community into believing in his greatness. "It's about legacy," Thomas announced, his voice booming over the guests. He gestured vaguely at the ornate crown molding and the expensive art on the walls. "My father left me a name, but I built this. I've ensured that the Miller name stands for something in this county. Stability, wealth, class." He turned his gaze toward Grace, his eyes narrowing with a familiar, sharp contempt. "Even if some members of this family haven't quite lived up to that standard, I've always been a man of my word. I've provided, I've protected." A ripple of appreciative murmurs went through the room. The mayor nodded, raising his glass. "To Thomas Miller, a man who knows the value of family." Grace felt a surge of cold fury. The rage spike hit her heart like a physical blow, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she took a slow sip of her water, the cold liquid a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the room. She looked at her watch. 10:14 a.m. "You speak a lot about value, Father," Grace said, her voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel. The table went quiet. Thomas lowered his glass, his expression shifting from jovial to a mask of irritation. "Grace, don't start. This isn't the time for your little grievances." "I was just thinking about the value of the house," she continued, standing up slowly. She felt the weight of the override key in her palm, a secret power that made her feel 10 feet tall. "And the value of the accounts you've been using to pay for this champagne. It's interesting how stability looks when you're standing on someone else's floor." Thomas laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that made the guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You've always been jealous, Grace. It's a pity. You have your mother's eyes, but none of her grace. You're lucky I let you back through these doors after the way you've behaved." "Lucky," Grace repeated, a thin smile touching her lips. "Yes, I suppose luck has a lot to do with it." She looked toward the foyer. The heavy oak doors were closed, but she could hear it now, the distinct, rhythmic crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Not the smooth, quiet hum of a luxury sedan, but the heavy, purposeful rumble of a professional vehicle. Jessica frowned, glancing toward the window. "Is someone else coming? I didn't authorize any more guests." Thomas waved a hand dismissively. "Probably just a late delivery. Sit down, Grace. You're making a scene." "I think the scene is just beginning," Grace said. She walked toward the foyer, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every guest at the table turned to watch her. She could see the confusion on their faces, the way the bank president leaned in to whisper to his wife, the way the mayor's brow furrowed. Grace reached the front door just as the doorbell rang, 3 sharp, authoritative chimes that echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the hallway. "Grace!" Thomas shouted, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped harshly against the floor. "I told you to sit down. I'll handle the door." "No," Grace said, her hand on the latch. She turned back to look at him, her silhouette framed by the morning light pouring through the transom window. "I've got it, Thomas. After all, it's my house." She pulled the door open. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Miller, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. Behind him stood a man in a plain gray suit holding a stack of legal folders, the process server. Behind them, 2 patrol cars sat with their lights off, silent sentinels in the winter sun. Sheriff Miller tipped his hat, his eyes moving past Grace to the man standing frozen at the head of the brunch table. "Morning, Grace," the sheriff said. "We're here for the scheduled execution of the court order." "Is the occupant ready?" Grace stepped aside, her eyes locked on her father's face. The color was already beginning to drain from his cheeks, the arrogance of the Miller legacy crumbling in real time as he realized the doorbell wasn't for a guest. It was for him. "He's ready," Grace said. "He just didn't think I'd be the one to open the door." The cold winter air rushed into the dining room, cutting through the steam of the expensive artisanal coffee and the scent of maple syrup. Sheriff Miller didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped onto the polished hardwood, his boots thumping with a finality that silenced the clinking of silver against china. Behind him, the man in the gray suit clutched a leather portfolio like a weapon, his eyes scanning the room with professional detachment. Behind them, the light from the patrol cars flickered against the hallway mirror, a rhythmic blue and red pulse that made the opulent foyer look like a crime scene. Thomas didn't stand. He remained at the head of the table, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered his crystal glass. He looked at the sheriff, then at Grace, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. "Sheriff, I don't know what kind of stunt my daughter thinks she's pulling, but this is a private family brunch. You're trespassing on Miller property. I suggest you leave before I make the phone calls that will end your career." "That's the thing, Thomas," the sheriff said, his voice as heavy as the lead on his belt. "It's not trespassing when the person who actually owns the deed invites you in." He nodded toward the process server. The man in the suit stepped forward, snapping open the portfolio with a crisp, metallic click. "Thomas Miller, you are hereby served with a writ of possession for the property located at 442 Miller Lane. Pursuant to the court order signed at 8 o'clock this morning, all unauthorized occupants are to vacate the premises immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. Jessica gasped, her fork clattering onto her porcelain plate with a sharp ring. She looked at her father, her face pale. "Dad, what is he talking about? This is our house." Grace didn't look at her sister. She kept her gaze fixed on the man at the head of the table. She watched the transformation begin. The color didn't just fade from his face. It retreated in a frantic tide, leaving his skin the sallow, sickly gray of wet ash. His eyes, once sharp with the practiced cruelty of a man who enjoyed his power, became wide and glassy, reflecting the sheriff's badge like a distorted, terrifying mirror. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a sudden, pathetic palsy that he couldn't control. The arrogance that usually sat on his shoulders like a heavy, expensive cloak vanished, replaced by a frantic, darting look in his eyes as they scanned the legal seal on the document. He looked smaller, the fine silk of his custom-tailored shirt suddenly appearing too large for his shrinking frame, as if the very air in the room had become too heavy for his lungs to process. He tried to speak, but only a wet, clicking sound emerged from his throat, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. "There must be a mistake," Jessica stammered, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. She reached out to touch the document, but the process server pulled it back. "Grace, tell them you didn't do this." "I didn't do this, Jessica," Grace said, her voice a calm, chilling contrast to her sister's hysteria. "The audit did. The years of unpaid taxes, the diverted trust funds, and the 3 mortgages Dad took out in my name without my knowledge did this." Zoe sat frozen, her small hands clutching the edge of the table. She looked at her grandfather, her eyes filled with a confusion that would soon turn to the same clarity Grace had lived with for years. The sheriff stepped further into the room, his presence commandingly physical. "We have movers waiting at the gate, Thomas. You have 1 hour to gather clothing and personal essentials. The furniture, the art, and the vehicles listed in the attachment stay with the estate." Thomas finally found his voice, though it was a ragged, thin thing. You can't. This is my legacy. I am a Miller." Grace walked toward him, her heels clicking slowly on the floor. She stopped at the head of the table, leaning down until she was inches from his face. The smell of his expensive cologne, something she used to associate with safety, now just smelled like rot. "You told me I didn't belong in this house because I didn't understand the value of a name," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I'm a risk auditor, Dad. I know exactly what your name is worth. On paper, it's a liability, and today I'm writing it off." She straightened her coat, not waiting for his response. She didn't need to hear his excuses or his threats. She had spent a lifetime listening to them. "Sheriff, the keys are on the hall table," Grace said, her voice clear and resonant. "I'll be at the hotel if there are any issues with the lockout." She turned and walked out, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind her, leaving the man who had stolen her life to face the cold reality of the one he had built. The gravel of the driveway crunched under Grace's heels, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the heavy silence of the evening. She didn't look back at the house, the sprawling, white-pillared monument to her father's vanity, but she could feel the weight of it behind her. The air tasted of ozone and damp earth, the scent of an approaching storm that matched the cold clarity settling in her chest. "You can't do this!" The scream shattered the quiet, raw and jagged with desperation. Grace Miller stopped beside her car, her hand resting on the cold metal of the door handle. She turned slowly. Thomas Miller was stumbling down the front steps, his face a mask of indignant fury. He looked absurd in his $3,000 Italian suit, waving a finger at Sheriff Miller, who stood like a stone wall at the base of the stairs. Behind them, the process server was calmly marking a line on a clipboard, his expression as bored as if he were delivering a pizza rather than an eviction notice. "Sheriff, arrest her," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "She's stolen my keys. She's trespassing on my property. Do you have any idea the damage you're doing to this family's reputation? I built this town." The sheriff didn't move. He didn't even blink. "The paperwork is in order, Thomas. The deed is in her name. The court order is signed. You have 15 minutes to gather personal essentials. Anything left behind will be inventoried and held until a formal pickup is scheduled." Thomas's expression didn't just crumble, it disintegrated. The deep, arrogant lines around his mouth, carved by decades of looking down on others, suddenly slackened into a mask of pathetic confusion. His skin transitioned from a blotchy, indignant scarlet to a waxy, translucent gray that made him look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. His lower lip developed a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor, and his eyes, usually sharp with predatory calculation, went glassy and unfocused, darting toward the heavy oak door as if he expected the house itself to apologize and let him back in. His shoulders, usually held with a practiced, military stiffness, slumped forward, making his expensive jacket hang off him like a shroud. It was the look of a man who had finally run out of people to lie to. "Jessica," he wheezed, turning toward his other daughter who stood huddled near the garage. "Jessica, tell them she's crazy. Tell them about the inheritance." Jessica Miller took a step back, her eyes wide as she looked from her father to the sheriff, then to the pile of designer luggage already sitting on the lawn. She clutched her leather handbag to her chest, the gold hardware glinting in the fading light. For years, she had been the golden child, the one who laughed at Thomas's cruel jokes and helped him gaslight Grace into submission. But Jessica was a creature of comfort, and she could smell the rot of a losing hand. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling but cold. "The sheriff said the deed is hers if you lied about the ownership, if you used the trust money for the mortgage." She stopped, her gaze shifting to Grace. "I didn't know, Grace. I swear I thought the house was his. I thought you were just being difficult." "You thought whatever kept your credit cards active, Jessica," Grace said, her voice devoid of heat. It was a flat, clinical observation that hit harder than a scream. "I'm your father." Thomas roared, finding a final, frantic spark of rage. He lunged toward Grace, but the sheriff moved with surprising speed, placing a heavy hand on his chest. "That's enough," the officer warned. The metallic jingle of handcuffs on the sheriff's belt was the only sound in the sudden vacuum of the driveway. Thomas stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at the sheriff, then at the process server, and finally at Grace. He looked for a weakness, a flicker of guilt, a shred of the daughter who used to beg for his approval. He found nothing but the reflection of his own failure in her steady, dark eyes. "You think you've won?" he hissed, leaning past the sheriff's arm. "You're a risk auditor, Grace. That's all you'll ever be, a bean counter. You'll sit in this big, empty house and realize you have no one. You've destroyed your family for a pile of bricks." "I didn't destroy this family, Thomas," she replied, her voice carrying clearly to the witnesses on the lawn. "I just audited it, and I found you to be a liability." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined case. She opened it, revealing the small, silver violin brooch that had belonged to Zoe Miller's grandmother, the one Thomas had tried to pawn to cover his last gambling debt. "The bricks aren't the prize. The truth is." She snapped the case shut and climbed into her car. The engine purred to life, a low, powerful growl that drowned out his final, incoherent protests. As she backed down the long, winding driveway, she caught one last glimpse of him in the rearview mirror. Thomas Miller was standing on the grass, surrounded by his daughter's luggage and the cold, unyielding representatives of the law. He looked small. For the first time in her life, he looked entirely, utterly insignificant. Grace didn't wait to see him escorted to the gate. She shifted into drive and pulled out onto the main road, the headlights cutting a path through the gathering dark. She had a hotel room booked for the night, a quiet space where the air didn't smell like his cologne or his lies. Tomorrow, the locks would be changed. Tomorrow, the forensic accountants would begin the deep dive into the rest of his legacy. But for tonight, the silence was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She reached over, touching the velvet case on the passenger seat, a small smile touching her lips as she drove away from the wreckage of the man who thought he was king. 6 months had passed since the locks were changed at the estate. Grace Miller sat in the lobby of the Metropolitan Conservatory, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that finally felt like it belonged to her. The air here smelled of fresh rain and expensive espresso, a sharp, clean contrast to the stale, suffocating weight of her father's former study. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, a deep emerald green that felt like a victory lap, and looked at the girl sitting beside her. Zoe Miller was busy tuning her new violin, her small fingers moving with a confidence that had been absent for years. The instrument was a masterpiece of maple and spruce, its varnish glowing under the recessed lighting of the lobby. It was the first thing Grace had bought after the forensic auditors finished unearthing the millions Thomas Miller had bled from her trust funds. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked, her voice soft but steady. "A little," Zoe admitted, though she didn't look it. She looked like a child who finally knew her floor wasn't going to fall out from under her. "But I practiced, and I have a good teacher now." Grace squeezed her shoulder. The cost of this piece had been high. Her sister, Jessica Miller, had fled to Florida the moment the scandal hit the local papers, unable to endure the social death of being associated with a man who stole from his own blood. She hadn't called Zoe once. She hadn't even asked for her clothes. Jessica had always been an enabler of their father's vanity, and without his stolen wealth to fund her lifestyle, she had simply vanished into a new life of desperate, sun-bleached reinvention. A heavy, metallic rattling sound echoed through the marble lobby. Grace looked toward the service entrance near the restrooms. A man in a faded, ill-fitting security uniform was pushing a gray plastic bin filled with trash. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed as if he were trying to memorize the pattern of the floor tiles. It was Thomas. The man who had once demanded the head of every table and the finest silk ties now wore a polyester blend with a crooked, plastic name tag. His hair, once meticulously groomed to project an image of silver-maned authority, was thin and unkempt. When he looked up and saw Grace, the color didn't just drain from his face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a sallow, hollowed-out mask. He froze, his hands trembling on the handle of the trash bin. For a flickering second, the old Thomas Miller tried to surface, a flash of indignant rage, the urge to bark a command about respect. But then his gaze shifted to the security camera mounted directly above Grace's head, and then to the polished, professional woman she had become. The realization hit him visibly. He wasn't the king of the county anymore. He was a man on a work release program, barely clinging to a minimum wage job that Grace's own firm provided the risk assessment oversight for. "Grace!" he croaked. The voice was thin, stripped of the resonant boom he used to terrace over her. She didn't stand. She didn't move toward him. She simply sat there, the light catching the simple, elegant watch on her wrist. "The recital begins in 10 minutes, Zoe. Why don't you go backstage and check your music one last time?" The girl looked at her grandfather. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only a distant, quiet pity that was far more cutting than any scream could have been. She nodded once, tucked her violin under her arm, and walked toward the stage doors without a word. Thomas took a stumbling step forward, the smell of industrial floor cleaner trailing after him like a shadow. "I heard you sold the house. My legacy. You sold it to a developer for a park." "I sold a liability, Thomas," Grace corrected him, her voice as level as a horizon line. "The court was very clear on the restitution schedule. I assume that's why you're working the weekend shift, to keep up with the interest." He flinched as if she'd struck him with a physical blow. "Jessica won't take my calls. She changed her number. She thinks I'm a burden." "Actions have consequences," she said, reaching into her leather bag to pull out the recital program. "Jessica only ever loved the reflection of your power. Now that you're just a man in a cheap uniform, she has no use for the mirror." "I'm your father," he whispered, a final, pathetic attempt to reach for the leverage he'd used for 30 years. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and realized the rage was gone. In its place was a cold, analytical clarity. "You were a guardian who treated his ward like a resource. You are a debtor who is currently behind on his payments. That is all you are to me." She turned her gaze back to the program, dismissing him as one might dismiss a typo in a spreadsheet. "Grace!" he called out, his voice cracking as a supervisor appeared at the end of the hall, pointing at a watch. "I have nothing left. I'm living in a studio above a garage." She didn't look back. "You have exactly what you earned," she said quietly. Inside the hall, the music began. Zoe played a complex, soaring piece that filled the gilded rafters. It was beautiful, but as Grace sat in the front row, she felt the weight of the 2 empty seats beside her. There was no sister to share the pride, no family left to celebrate the survival. She had one. She had reclaimed every cent, every brick, and every bit of her dignity. But as the final note faded into a thunderous standing ovation, Grace realized that justice, while necessary, was a quiet, solitary house to live in. She smiled for Zoe as the girl bowed, but the smile was a fragile thing, carried on the back of a victory that had cost her everything she once thought was home.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.